Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of 10 minutes of ancient warfare-related material to distract you from whatever's going on in your real life. Or indeed, this is your real life, and therefore just keeping distractions away. Now, what I do here is I attempt to answer a question from a reader, viewer, or listener that they send to me by postcard, by email, by running into me into the street, more of that anon, by responding to a previous video or podcast. You can back us on Patreon, one of 3 different levels. You can send us a question that way, but you don't have to be a patron. But of course, we would really appreciate it if you were. Just go to Patreon/Ancient Warfare Podcast. Today's question is from Bree and has involved me doing a bit of a deep dive into the subject at hand, which is about dancing. Now, you can't see my physique. I'm not a dancer, shall we say, although my children tell me that I'm not a dancer. Maybe I am. Anyway, so what was the relationship between Korybantic or Kouretic dances and ancient warfare? I know that the Pyrrhic dance was just training, but the aforementioned dances have much more spiritual significance, such as ecstasy and warding of spirits. Could these beliefs have influenced warfare technology, like how iron was used? Ooh. Okay, so the martial training dances of the ancient world, we generally say the Pyrrhic dance. Problem with that is that it's a corruption of the Pyrrhicae, which has a whole bunch, or the Pyrrhicios, which has a whole bunch of different etymologies. Those etymologies are actually tied up with the Kouretic and the Korybantic dance. So they're not necessarily separate or different. They are, or could quite easily be tied together. And there's a whole different bunch of etymologies, one of which is Pyrrhus, but Pyrrhus is not Pyrrhus of Epirus, which is the famous Pyrrhus, but in fact Pyrrhus is another name in Greek for Neoptolemus, who's the son of Achilles, who according to some versions is the originator of the dance, but more of that anon. So I think they're all tied together, and I think that they're all tied together with, yes, they are dances and they are spiritual and religious, but they are also tied to being military training from a very early time, which we'll get to. So the first answer is, of course, about the Korybantic or Kouretic dances. And again, there's a whole bunch of different etymologies. So you have the Korybantes or the Korybants, who are armed and crested dancers, who are especially associated with the Phrygian goddess Cybele or Cybele. And also some people think that it comes from a Macedonian word, rephe, which means crown, top, or mountain peak, but the beta as opposed to the phi is probably unlikely to be a mistake, so not necessarily. There's a whole bunch of mythological ideas about whether the Korybantes were the offspring of Apollo and Thalia, or of Apollo and Rhaetia, and others say that they were the children of Zeus and Calliope, or Helios and Athena, or Kronos. So lots of confusing etymologies and origins of who they were and where they were. Their dance seems to have been an ecstatic one, and the Kouretes were ecstatic dancers, 9 of them, and they have a Cretan dance, which is in honor of Cybele. Now, how does that all tie into militarism? So it seems that the dancers are trained young and they are armored and armed. They seem to wear helmets and carry shields. There seems to be a rhythmic stamping of the feet, which ties into drill and counter-marching that you get in the phalanx. And there's all sorts of interesting connections there that Plato and others make with why dancing, without specifying which, is useful to young men training to be soldiers. The other idea, of course, is that you have these ecstatic male dancers. Of course, we know about ecstatic women dancers, but these are ecstatic males. So there's a kind of an ecstasy aspect to it, which is where your point about the spiritualism comes in. But it is meant to be a a militaristic dance. So I'll get back to the militarism. I wrote about this once upon a time, back in 2020 in Ancient Warfare 14.3, if you want to look it up. Footloose Hoplites, I called it, which was a reference to Kevin Bacon, because you're never far away from Kevin Bacon. Anyway, dance training in Ancient Warfare. So that was the name of the article, Footloose Hoplites, Dance Training in Ancient Warfare. And of course, mostly that looks at the Pyrrhic, which is the dance which seems to date back at least to Homer, or at least Homer refers to it. So it probably predates Homer. And what you get, of course, is Achilles' dance around the funeral pyre of Patroclus. And we also have various different depictions of the Pyrrhic dance in art and from pottery and sculpture. As I said before, some people credit it with Pyrrhus, which is another name for Achilles' son Neoptolemus. Some credit Achilles himself from the Iliad references. And of course, there are different Greek cultures that claim the dance. One is Sparta, one is Crete. And again, you can find sources on these which disagree, which is one of the fascinating aspects of the ancient world's mythological writings. Disagreeing and having variations doesn't matter. It's not wrong. It's just added to. Oh, you have that story. Well, we have this story. It's not like ours is right, yours is wrong. So in Athens, the dancers are connected to Athena herself. And of course, according to some myths, as soon as she emerges from Zeus's thigh or head, she dances the Pyrrhic. So, according to Lucian, as soon as she was born, she leapt up and down in a war dance, shaking her shield and poising her spear, full of the spirit of battle. And then you get Dionysius of Halicarnassus also crediting Athena with the invention of the dance, and Plato, who even says that the epithet Pallas Athenae, is from armed dancing. The interesting thing about the Pyrrhic is that it's danced by both men and women, and indeed the best piece of it, the two best pieces of dance evidence are actually from Xenophon's Anabasis and from Plato, both the Laws and the Symposium, but I'll get onto that in a second. And so what you have is this idea of this dance, but it seems to have been from its earliest inception that you danced with armor, or you danced with a shield and a helmet and with a spear. And so it's connected with military accoutrement from its beginnings, and it's very quickly linked to training in terms of the stepping. And, one of the countermarches in the Tactica, I always mention the Tactica, which are the Hellenistic Tactica, is indeed the choir or dance countermarch. So very clearly, stepping in time is very useful for training military units to stay in time to do a particular maneuver. What we have is, Athenaeus says it's a Lacedaemonian invention, and the reason he says that is that in the 2nd century AD, the only Greeks still learning the dance were the Spartans, Spartan boys who learned it from the age of 5 onwards. By then, of course, the spears were replaced with the thyrsus, and that's the staff of Dionysus. So again, there's sort of this blurring of the lines. Now, as I said, the best descriptions of these dances actually in Plato. So this is a passage from the Laws, 814e, if you're following along. It represents modes of eluding all kinds of blows and shots by swervings and duckings and side leaps upward or crouching, and also the opposite kinds of motion, which lead to active postures of offense, when it strives to represent the movements involved in shooting with bows or darts and blows of every description. In all these cases, the action and the tension of the sinews are correct when there is a representation of fair bodies and souls in which most of the limbs of the body are extended straight. Thanks for that very long sentence, Plato. But you can see there that the dance seems to have involved not just the stamping of feet or leaping. We'll get to the Trojan leap in a minute, but the idea of it sounds like a martial art, that the dance emulated the eluding of all kinds of blows and shots by swervings and duckings and side leaps, upwards or crouching. So, all of these sorts of things. And then at the same time, there are offensive actions in the dance which emulate attacks. So that's, quite an amazing description. Plato's laws in general prescribes that warriors learn two gymnastic skills, wrestling and dancing. I've written on wrestling as well in ancient warfare, to train warriors in the versatility of using all their limbs, left and right, equally, which is still good advice to this day. Plato's Athenian stranger in the laws encourages learning the sword dance of the Kouretes in Crete. So that ties back to the Kouretes Korybants. Are they in fact the same dance, or are they variations of the same dance? But they're all connected to ancient warfare training, whether it be ecstatic or, which comes first, the warfare training or the ecstasy, or do they all meld at once? And of course, the other one is the dance of the Dioscuri in Lacedaemon, Athena's dance in full panoply, which is presumably the Pyrrhic. So there's these three dances which are all recommended as military training. And then Plato goes on to say that in some accounts the Kouretes are even credited with the invention of the Pyrrhic. So the Pyrrhic comes from the Kouretes. And there are, of course, other sources that describe any martial dance as a Pyrrhic, which doesn't help us. We then get this fascinating passage in the Anabasis by Xenophon, which talks about the dances put on to entertain the Paphlagonian ruler Korylas. And one of them is two Thracians rise up and begin a dance in full armour to the music of a flute, leaping high and lightly, using their sabres. Finally, one struck the other. It seemed to everyone that the man had been mortally wounded. He fell artfully, and the Paphlagonians set up a cry. Then the first man despoiled the other of his arms and marched out singing a Thracian war song, while other Thracians carried off the fallen dancer as though he were dead. In fact, he had not been hurt at all. So that's a whole mock combat, but probably one that is choreographed. Then there's some Athenians and Magnesians who arise to dance under arms in a dance called the Carpaea. We don't know anything else about that other than this reference in Xenophon. The manner of the dance was this: a man is sowing and driving a yoke of oxen, his arms laid at one side, and he turns about frequently as one in fear. A robber approaches. As soon as the sower sees him coming, he snatches up his arms, goes to meet him, and fights with him to save his oxen. The two men do all this in the rhythm to the music of the flute. Note that both of these dances were done to the flute. Finally, the robber binds the man and drives off the oxen, or sometimes the master of the oxen binds the robber, and then he yokes him alongside the oxen with his hands tied behind him and then drives off. So that's another dance which is a whole story, but with two different outcomes, choreographed. After this, a Mysian came carrying a light shield in each hand, and at one moment in his dance he would go through a pantomime as though two men were arrayed against him, and again he would use his shield as though against one antagonist, and again he would whirl and throw somersaults whilst holding the shield, and while holding his shield in his hand, so that he seemed to offer a fine spectacle. So again, this is a shield dance, but it seems to be like the way Plato described the offensive and defensive maneuvers of the Pyrrhic. Lastly, he danced the Persian dance, the Persicon, clashing his shield together and crouching down and then rising up again. All this he did keeping in time to the music of the flute. 3 to the flute. After him, the Mantineans came forward, and some of the other Arcadians arose, arrayed in the finest arms and accoutrements they could command, and marched in time to the accompaniment of a martial hymn played on the flute, and they sang the paean and danced. So again, that connection is very obvious between martial training and dancing. And they looked on as though the Paphlagonians looked on and thought all of these strange dances under arms, because, of course, then the last one is a Mysian brings on a dancing girl and she dances the Pyrrhic, which is again is evidence of the women learning to dance the Pyrrhic, even though it's a martial dance. So there's huge numbers of variations of dance, and even though we've got the Pyrrhic that we know about and the Kouretes that we know about, there's things like the Persicon and the Carpaea, which we don't know so much about. But it would seem that every culture has a martial dance which is linked to training and dancing to celebrate as well as warfare. So all of these things are happening all at once. Oh gosh, look at me raving on. So anyway, there's other evidence in the Symposium of Xenophon about Socrates, and Socrates liking dancing and saying that essentially in agreement with the Athenian stranger from the laws that, the whole body is working when you're dancing, and that's a great thing. So, Bree, I hope that answers your question. I think they're all connected with warfare, whether it be the Korybantic, the Kouretic, the Pyrrhic, or other dances, and that I think the spiritual significance is tied into the warfare. And in terms of the warding of spirits and the protection, I think that also is tied into warfare, that it's a protective, by being in the army for the ancient Greek state, you are protecting, and that's part of the protection aspect of the dance itself. So there you go. I think hopefully that answers your question. Join me again for another ancient warfare answer. I'll see you then. Bye.